Just because something looks good on the outside doesn't mean it really is. If something seems off, that's most likely the case. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to my channel and Killer Concepts, the place where we talk about all things true crime. My name is Peyton. I have been on a hiatus. I have forgotten to mention this because time has passed me by, but October was Domestic Violence Awareness Month. I am disappointed that I missed this, but I was taking a much needed break, which was explained in one of last week's videos. If you have been following my channel for a while, then you know how important domestic violence awareness is to me, so it shouldn't be surprising that in honor of Domestic Violence Awareness Month, which we missed, we are going to be talking about yet another domestic violence case. I know this isn't unusual for this channel, but I found one I would really like to talk about that occurred in 2006 on Thanksgiving Day. This holiday just passed us, so this is actually pretty good timing. I meant to have it out before Thanksgiving, but things just did not work out that way. Before we get started, please make sure to hit that red subscribe button down below and turn on your post notifications so you do not miss any future content. If you or anyone you know may be suffering from domestic violence, please call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 900-799-7233. You can also reach out through chat on their website or send them the text START in all capital letters, S-T-A-R-T, to 88788. Also, big trigger warning on this case. A lot of the victim's injuries are hard to hear and we do discuss them. This case is just horrible in general, to be honest. So the case we're talking about today is the murder of Ashley Scott. Ashley Scott was a 28-year-old high school English teacher who was murdered by her husband, Jeffrey Scott, on Thanksgiving Day in 2006. So let's jump on into it. On the afternoon of November 23rd, Thanksgiving Day 2006, Jeffrey Scott would call 911 to report that his 28-year-old wife, Ashley Scott, was in their home unconscious. While on the phone with Scott, the dispatcher would hear a physician by the name of Roger McGee in the background telling Scott that his wife was dead. According to Investigation Discovery, when the emergency medical personnel arrived, they would find Ashley unconscious on the floor. Her lips were swollen and split, and blood was coming out of her mouth, ears, and nose. She would be taken to the hospital, but she would pass away from her injuries that evening. When police would ask Scott what happened to his wife, he would tell them that they were drinking and he pushed her, causing her to fall to the floor. This is when he would say she got hurt. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened. So let's rewind for a second. I want to talk a little bit about who Ashley was and how she would meet her husband and eventually her murderer. So Ashley was born on November 4th, 1978. Her mother, Donna, was pregnant with her when she would meet and eventually marry a man by the name of Jimmy. Jimmy would adopt Ashley and treat her as his own. When her mom would get together with Jimmy, Ashley would also gain a stepsister by the name of Keisha. Ashley's mother walked out on her adoptive father, Jimmy, stepsister Keisha, and herself on her 12th birthday. They also had to survive on her adoptive father's blue-collar salary, which wasn't a lot of money. It was significantly less than that of Jeremy's family. Even so, in American Monster, Tell Me You Love Me, Ashley's friends and family said that she still had a really good childhood. She was a cheerleader and had a bubbly personality as well as being very happy and carefree. In 1996, Ashley would graduate from high school. Ashley's best friend Lori Macon, that she had been close to since the 5th grade, said that when her and Ashley were going to the same Christian college, Washita Baptist University, and Ashley met Jeffrey, everything at first seemed normal. The two would meet in 1988 through a mutual friend, at the time Jeffrey Scott, who was a 22-year-old business major. Lori and another friend of Ashley's, Erin May, were both there when she first met Jeffrey. They described described him as being very shy and kind of standoffish. At first, everything seemed fine, but she did notice small changes. It seemed as Ashley got closer to Jeffrey, she would start to distance herself more and more from her friends. Investigation Discovery describes his family as a traditional family. His parents were married, his dad had a good job, and they lived in an upper-class suburb in Memphis, Tennessee. This was far from the upbringing that the beautiful Ashley had. Jeff's mother also stayed home and took care of the house while his father worked. Jimmy and Kesha would stay in contact with Ashley while she was in college, but as she got closer with Jeffrey, the less they would hear from her. In the winter of 1998, Ashley would return home for her friend Erin's wedding. At the time, the relationship between Ashley and Jeffrey was not too serious. However, she did tell her friends that she felt Jeffrey had the ideal family. Erin May, Ashley's friend, said, quote, "I could hear him speaking to her over the phone. He wasn't being very nice. There was some implications that he deserved more than her, that he was above her," end quote. Not long after the wedding, her stepsister Keisha would say that Ashley would go home with Jeffrey to spend Christmas with him and his family. At that time, she would become pretty unreachable, which wasn't typical for her. This would only continue to get worse throughout her senior year at college. Her adoptive father, Jimmy, would tell American Monster that he would try and call Ashley, and he would be told that she wasn't there. Eventually, when he did get a hold of her, she would say that they didn't want him calling her and that she couldn't have anything to do with him anymore. To make this worse, a week or two later, Kesha would receive a handwritten letter in the mail from Ashley. It would say that she needed to start a new life and she had the opportunity to do that with Jeffrey. It would also ask that they please no longer contact her. On Christmas in 2000, Jeffrey Scott would ask Ashley to marry him. At the time, she was still in frequent contact with her friends, and she would tell them how excited she was. Then on June 9th, 2001, at Forest Hill Baptist in Germantown, Tennessee, the two would marry. Her friends Erin and Lori described how she seemed different at the wedding. While happy, they just noticed that she was pretty much living a completely different life surrounded by Jeffrey's friends and family. Ashley and Jeffrey would buy a house in the Memphis suburb of Cordova. Here he would work for his father's IT company, and Ashley would be a high school English teacher. Then in September of 2006, Ashley would head home to attend her 10-year class reunion with her friends. While there, she seemed very happy and herself, but her friends would notice Jeffrey would keep calling her. He seemed to be questioning her in a very rude and controlling manner. He just sounded very agitated that she was even there. After this reunion, there would be several weeks when Ashley's best friend Lori would say that Ashley hadn't been returning her calls. However, Jeff would call her back. Jeffrey Scott would begin calling Lori and telling her that Ashley was beginning to drink a lot and he was actually really concerned. He would even tell her that she was drinking so much that she was falling down and waking up with bruises. In August of 2005, Ashley was charged with a DUI. He apparently was really concerned and Ashley wasn't answering Lori's calls, so she really only had his side of the story. It wasn't until Thanksgiving Day of 2006 when Ashley Scott would finally return her friend Lori's phone calls. Lori missed the call and she called back, left a voicemail, and waited to hear back from her, but her friend never did call her back. Lori told American Monster that until this day, she still wishes she would have been able and available to answer that initial call from her friend. This is because at 3:46 p.m., Jeffrey Scott would make a call to 911. He wanted to report that his wife was unconscious and that she was bleeding from her head. He would tell the dispatchers that she had been unconscious since sometime that morning and didn't know why she was bleeding. Before calling 911, Jeffrey Scott would call a friend of his by the name of Dr. Robert McGee. McGee would would testify in court that he had been friends with Scott for over 20 years. That day, he would receive a call in the afternoon from Jeff asking what he was doing the rest of the day. After the doctor answered, Jeff would ask if he would come to the house to take a look at Ashley because he had some concerns about her. Court records state that Dr. McGee said Jeff's voice had an element of concern, but not an element of urgency. McGee asked him questions like if the two had been drinking, and he would respond by saying that they had. When McGee would finally arrive to the home, Jeff would point him to the couple's bedroom where he testified Ashley was, quote, very bruised and beaten, end quote. Right after he got to take a look at Ashley closer, he would tell Jeff to call 911. EMS would find Ashley in the upstairs bedroom where they would see blood coming out of her ears and nose. Her lips were split and blood and vomit was coming out of her mouth. McGee was also seen giving Ashley CPR at the time. 28-year-old Ashley Scott would be taken to the hospital, but she would be pronounced dead at 7:52 p.m. on Thanksgiving Day, 2006. Jeff's dad would tell her friend Lori that her friend had died. So what happened to Ashley? Jeffrey Scott would at first tell police that he struck his wife and she had fallen due to the alcohol she had consumed, but only more information would continue to come out. He would claim that the two had gotten into an argument about a phone call or text that Ashley had received while the two had been drinking. He said this would turn into a physical altercation. After this, Scott would be detained. The altercation would apparently get so bad that he would throw her out into the garage and leave her there all night. Court documents state that this was from 9 p.m. to 9 a.m. He would then drag her back into the house and put her in front of the fireplace at 9 a.m. She was unconscious. He would soon check on her again, and when she was still unconscious, he would pick her up and put her in their bed upstairs at 12 p.m. This is when he would call Dr. McGee. Jeff would also report that even though she was unconscious, she was, quote, breathing fine, end quote, throughout the day. The medical examiner who would look at Ashley's injuries would rule her death as resulting from, quote, multiple injuries as a result of a beating, end quote, per Action News 5. These injuries included multiple blunt force trauma, which included severe head injuries. More specifically, an emergency room physician at the hospital Ashley was taken to would report that when he treated the victim on November 23, 2006, she was not breathing on her own and had bruising throughout her body. Per court documents, Dr. Rodriguez recalled a large bruise on her right flank that, quote, looked like a foot mark or boot mark, end quote. He also said that one of her ears were swollen and described it as cauliflower ear. For those of you who don't know, cauliflower ear is usually seen on someone who has been struck multiple times in the ear. This is something that a lot of wrestlers tend to get, or boxers, whatever. Somebody who would be getting that kind of head trauma. Rodriguez also said, quote, that based on his training in recognizing child abuse, the victim's extensive bruising raised the suspicion that there was some pattern of abuse here, and she had clear evidence that there was potential abuse, end quote. Dr. Rodriguez testified that the victim's fixed pupils indicated that she was either comatose or semi-comatose, and that she may have had a brain injury. He said that a CAT scan indicated that the victim had severe swelling of the brain with the shifting of the brain, end quote. More specifically, he reported that the CAT scan showed a, quote, subdural hematoma along the right side with a midline shift and massive cerebral edema, end quote. Also in the court documents, a pulmonary and critical care physician, Dr. Michael Smith, said that his first impression of Ashley was that she looked like someone who had been beaten to death. He would testify that she had bruising on, quote, both legs, knees, stomach, her back, her face, her ear, her head, and both arms, end quote. He would also describe the one bruise as looking like a footprint, just as Dr. Rodriguez had. At the time of Ashley's death, her alcohol level in her system was extremely high, enough to be toxic, but not fatal. Doctors would rule this out as her cause of death. On top of the immense amount of physical damage to Ashley's person, physical evidence of an assault would also be found in the home. A Memphis police officer, Patricia K. Turnmeyer, would testify in court that she would find what appeared to be bodily fluids or blood on the floor of the garage, as well as a broken vase and dried flower arrangement in the garbage can in the garage on November 23rd. She would then do a walkthrough of the house, and this is where she would see a purse, cell phone, Jeffrey's passport, and a wine bottle on the kitchen counter. She would say there was a vase and dried flower arrangement on the mantle of the fireplace. This arrangement would match the one that was in the garage trash can. She would then see a house shoe and pillow next to the fireplace, as well as broken pieces of vase. She would also find some type of fluid on the floor of the master bedroom, but it would not be identified in time to be used in the trial. Also, in American Monster, they mention that the day before she died, Ashley had spoken to an attorney to say that she wanted to divorce Jeffrey. The attorney had said that she saw proof of domestic abuse, and the lawyer suggested Ashley not go home, but she wanted to tell Jeffrey she was leaving. She had even begun putting clothes in her car before she was murdered. So now that we went into Ashley's injuries and the crime scene, we know she looks like she had been assaulted. So now we have to see if there was a history of abuse. Court documents report that a man named Paul Dooley, who worked with Ashley Scott, said that after she was arrested for her DUI in August of 2005, she would begin to complain to him about verbal and emotional abuse. She would even call him at one point to say she wouldn't make it into work because the couple was fighting. Even worse, on July 29th, 2006, Ashley would call him at 3:15 a.m. to report that her husband, Jeffrey, had hit her and strangled her. But Dooley would not be the only person Ashley would come to with allegations of abuse. A woman named Elizabeth Sissom, who became friends with Ashley after Ashley was her student teacher in 2003, would also say the victim had called her. The two commonly stayed in contact through emails and instant messaging, but Ashley would call her not long after Thanksgiving in 2005. Ashley would call Sissom from a woman named Claire Brown's phone, saying she was just assaulted. Sissom testified, quote, she refused to go to Thanksgiving dinner, that she and the defendant were not getting along. She proceeded to tell her that he tried to choke her, and then she went on to talk about some sex life, that the defendant was into porn, that the defendant refused to kiss her, that she would ask him to kiss her, and he wouldn't do it, end quote. Ashley would also tell her that Jeffrey often verbally and emotionally abused her. Elizabeth would also report that she had been worried about Ashley's drinking ever since her DUI, as she told her she pretty much got drunk every day. Now, after her murder and knowing that she was in an abusive relationship, we can assume some of this may be tied to that. So, Virginia Blair Brown would also get on the stand during the trial and would back up Ashley's claim to Sissom about her being choked by Jeffrey. In the court documents, it says, quote, on one occasion in November 2005, the victim went to Miss Brown's house and was lying on the bed in Miss Brown's bedroom when the defendant arrived. Miss Brown testified that the defendant, quote, had been drinking and was in a rage, end quote. She said that he, quote, punched her in the back about 3 times real fast, end quote. She recalled that she got him away from the victim and made him leave her house, but when she asked the victim about calling the police, the victim told her not to call them, end quote. Another thing about Blair Brown. So I had also heard in American Monster that apparently Blair Brown and Jeffrey had had an affair at some point. Ashley and her had a falling out, were no longer friends, but then they had become friends again, and this is when this would all happen, after they had become friends again. Okay. Now I could go on and all about all of the testimony in the court documents, as there is so much of it and there's a lot of witnesses of things, but I already just kind of bombarded you with information. However, I think we can all see that there was a pattern of abuse here and a very volatile relationship. The two both seemed to get pretty rowdy when drunk, but unfortunately it seems Jeffrey had a temper, and it could be a violent one. So with all of the evidence left on Ashley's body, the physical evidence in the house, and all of the witness testimony, Jeffrey Scott would obviously be charged with the murder of Ashley Scott, and it would happen quite quickly. Jeffrey Scott would be found guilty for the second-degree murder of his wife, Ashley Scott, 28, at the end of January 2009. Jeffrey was 32 at this time. Then in February of 2009, Jeffrey would finally be sentenced to 25 years in prison. According to everyone, Ashley was a wonderful woman, and this was an incredible loss to anyone who knew her and everyone who loved her. Unfortunately, like I mentioned earlier, I wonder if Ashley's apparent drinking problems were a result of the abuse that she was enduring in her relationship. If you watched my video last week, we talked about some of the signs of abuse, and so let's just kind of talk about some of them that we can see in this case. One of the biggest red flags to me was that when she met Jeffrey, all of her friends described him as very quiet, very kind, which a lot of abusers tend to hide that until you're basically stuck with them. Now, quiet and kind doesn't mean that somebody's an abuser, but he was described, and that's why Ashley liked him. He was described as very laid back at first and all that. But my biggest red flag was that he started separating her from the people she cared about, from her friends, from her family. So he showed her the life that he had, and then he really didn't like when she hung out with her friends. And then it became that all of a sudden Ashley didn't want to talk to her father and her sister that she used to talk to all the time. There was even a statement made that they didn't want her talking to them. And then, towards the end, even her best friend, Lori, couldn't get a hold of her. The separation is just such a huge sign of abuse. There's really, if you're not close to anybody and you're disconnected from your friends and your family, then there's really not many people you can go to if something bad's happening. And then obviously we had the bruises, we had her reaching out to people for help, and then even with her alcohol addiction that she ended up getting could also be a sign of it on top of everything else. So that's all I have on this case. It was a terrible one. Like I said, the court documents are very descriptive in her injuries. That's obviously in my links down below if you want to read more of the court documents. It was from an appeal. If you or anyone you know may be suffering from domestic violence, please reach out to the domestic violence hotline. You can text, email, chat, or call them. They also have a quick exit on their website for emergency situations. Don't let yourself or someone you love become part of the statistics and the cycle of abuse. Please make sure to hit that red subscribe button down below and turn on your post notifications so you do not miss any future content. You can follow me on social. All of my handles are down below in the description box, as well as all of my sources for today's video. I meant to mention this earlier, but my heart goes out to Ashley's friends and family who had lost a loved one so senselessly. If you have any case suggestions, please send them to killerconceptsvlog@gmail.com or comment them down below. And before you go, just remember that the world's most dangerous minds hide in the most unlikely places. Stay safe.